Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This video is part 2 in our two-part series on the Garmin G1000 NXI upgrade. Part 1 focused on the non-navigational improvements that have been made to the NXI, and I'll leave a link to that video in this video's description. This video will focus on changes that have been made to the navigational system, which is where most of the improvements, and in my opinion the best of the improvements, are concentrated. Working Title has completely revamped the navigation system for this upgrade, and in doing so has made the NXI a piece of equipment that can be used for serious navigation, including complex flight planning and study and practice on real-world instrument procedures, particularly RNAV or GPS-based procedures. As I mentioned in the last video, this video will be conducted as differences training from the old G1000, so I won't be going over the basics of how to use the unit. It won't be as important for working the GPS on the NXI as much of the system is new, but if you want a refresher on how the basics of the G1000 work, I'll leave a link to that video series in this video's description as well. So what's different about the navigation system on the NXI? For starters, Working Title has completely overhauled the flight plan management system. Working Title decided to build a new navigation system from the ground up rather than utilize the default nav system in Microsoft Flight Simulator, which has a lot of shortcomings and quirks. It could be very finicky and frustrating on how it behaved, often doing things that were unexpected or abnormal, like sudden U-turns, flying to a different fix than what was indicated on the system, and incorrect loading or execution of procedures, to name just a few. With the overhaul of the flight plan management system, the system now works as it should in the real unit almost all the time. In fact, I haven't encountered any glaring examples of the unit doing anything it shouldn't on any of the flights I've used it on. All the flight plans and procedures I've tried thus far have loaded correctly and could be easily and correctly flown. And if that's not enough, there are a number of other features that they have also added as well. This includes correct direct to function. It used to be that the direct function didn't work super great. It would kind of create an additional leg in the flight plan, and it was kind of a different color and a different size than the rest of the legs in the flight plan, and it didn't work exactly correctly. And you also didn't have the ability to redirect. If you got off course and then wanted to go direct from your present position to the fix that you plan to navigate to, it couldn't do that. You either had to steer yourself back on course and then activate the nav function, or you would have to delete that point and then add a different point and add it back in. It was very cumbersome to try to get it to work correctly. But now the direct function works correctly. You can redirect. It works much smoother now. You also now have the ability to load airways in a flight plan. Previously in the G1000, you had to, if you wanted to fly on an airway, you had to load each point on that airway, or you had to at least load the anchor points for any particular segment of the airway. But now you can actually enter the airway and it will enter the entire route or the entire airway, complete with all the points on that airway for you. So it's a much more efficient way to do that if you want to fly on airways. It also has improved loading of instrument and procedures. This includes standard instrument departures or SIDs, standard terminal arrival routes or STARS, and instrument approaches. And you can load all of those procedures. You can load them from any point at which you can begin the procedure. And the procedures will now all load correctly and can be flown correctly. It also now features support for all 23 AirInc 424 leg types. Well, that sounds kind of complicated. What exactly does that mean? In order to create a flight plan and display an instrument procedure for navigation, the GPS needs to be able to use 23 different leg types, referred to as the AirInc 424 leg types. The original G1000 and Flight Sim, as well as the other GPS receivers in the game, including the GNS 530 and 430, didn't utilize these. The navigation system wasn't basically built on this system. So many of the procedures or their transitions either weren't available in the GPS to fly, or they didn't load or execute correctly. But when Working Title revamped the flight plan management system on the NXI, they based the system that they built around these leg types. This means that pretty much any procedure or transition that's available in an airport in real life can now be loaded and flown correctly in the sim. Examples of the procedure types that were previously not flyable that now work on the NXI include standard instrument approach procedure turns, holding pattern type procedure turns, charted teardrop type procedure turns, and DME arcs. In addition, the GPS now has missed approach procedures in the GPS database. Previously, in the old G1000 and in the GNS 530 and 430, these procedures simply weren't there. They weren't in the database. So if you wanted to do a missed approach procedure, you were on your own. You had no navigational guidance from the GPS. But now these procedures are loaded in the NXI, and they work correctly. In other words, you have to press the suspension soft key in order for them to sequence to the missed approach procedure, which brings me to my next point. The unit now features correct waypoint sequencing and suspension of waypoint sequencing. We talked about this a little bit in the last video, that it will correctly sequence between waypoints, but it will also, in the situations where it's not supposed to automatically sequence to the next waypoint, it will suspend waypoint sequencing. One example of that is if you hit your missed approach point, it doesn't automatically sequence to the missed approach procedure. You have to do some manual intervention to get it to do that, and that all now works correctly. It also has guidance for visual approaches. This includes both lateral and vertical or Vnav guidance for doing visual approaches, and this works quite well. It also includes the ability to load and fly holding patterns. This includes published holding patterns, like the holding pattern you'll find typically at the end of a missed approach procedure, and you can build your own custom holding patterns as well. It also includes correct GPS CDI scaling. We talked about this in the last video. Basically, the distance that you have to be off course to get full scale deflection on the CDI needle changes based on where you are in your flight plan, whether you're in the terminal area, whether you're en route, or whether you're on an approach. So now the scaling works correctly and changes between the scaling correctly. So it all works like it does in the real unit in real life. It also currently includes arrival and approach Vnav function in the current build, which means you can put an altitude in your flight plan if you want to go from your cruising altitude and cross a waypoint at a certain altitude. You will get guidance for that, and you can actually couple that to the autopilot now. And with Sim Update 10, we also get en route and VFR Vnav function. So any point in any flight plan, you will be able to put an altitude in there if you want vertical guidance for that. And this is specific just to the flight simulator, but we now have a keyboard entry interface where there's a little symbol that we can click on, and it allows us to enter waypoints and nav aids and things like that in the flight plan using the keyboard. Not necessarily realistic, but it is very efficient, and I think it's appropriate because simulating twisting the knobs is much more cumbersome than actually twisting the knobs in real life. So this gives us a little bit of efficiency, and it makes it very efficient to load a flight plan in the G1000 now. To learn how to use all these new features, we'll take a look at two different flight plans. The first one will be a relatively simple flight plan with just a few points to learn the basics of flight planning and editing flight plans with the unit. The second will be more complex with an instrument departure, airways, and an instrument arrival and instrument approach. Before we dive in, I'll mention that you can still load flight plans in the NXI using the Flight Planner in Microsoft Flight Simulator or by using a third-party app like Little Nav Map. But with the new keyboard interface, I personally find it easier and more efficient to load a flight plan manually on the GPS than using the Flight Simulator Planner. And with the updates included in Sim Update 10, it's going to be possible to get an IFR clearance on a flight plan that you load solely in the GPS. The first route we'll look at will be familiar to you if you've watched any of my other GPS tutorials. We'll fly a simple route from Tell City Airport in southern Indiana to Bardstown, Kentucky, just to the south of Louisville. The route for the flight will be from Tell City Airport, which is Kilo Tango Echo Lima, direct to the cargo intersection, Charlie Romeo Romeo Golf Oscar, direct to the Elizabethtown Airport, or Addington Field, which is Kilo Echo Kilo X-Ray, direct to New Hope VOR, which is Echo Whiskey Oscar, direct to the Bardstown Airport, which is Kilo Bravo Romeo Yankee. This flight plan allows us to demonstrate how to enter a simple route in the flight planner and shows that you can use any 5-letter waypoint or intersection, any nav aid, and any airport as a point on your flight plan. So as far as setup for this flight, I will select the Cessna 172 G1000 edition. I am going to go ahead and give it full tanks of gas. It's not that long of a flight, though. If you don't want to do that, you could do something different. And then I will set up the departure airport is going to be Tel City, which is Kilo Tango Echo Lima. So I will go ahead and select that. That is Perry County Municipal. And I am going to launch off of runway 13. I'll go ahead and start the flight there. If you feel funny about sitting on a runway and loading a flight plan, you could always start on the ramp and go through the startup process. It really doesn't matter that much what you want to do with that. I am not going to select a destination or anything that's going to have the flight planner load anything in the GPS. I do want to do it all manually. And as far as flight conditions, really, it doesn't really matter for this one. I'm going to go ahead and pick a mid-April day. I'll probably do it about 9 o'clock in the morning. That seems to kind of minimize turbulence with the current sim state. So I will do that. I'll probably put some puffy clouds in there for the weather for when we depart. And that is about all we need to fly. So we'll go ahead and click on fly and start loading our flight plan. So before we get to talking about loading our flight plan, let's talk about the new keyboard interface. This is available through either the direct page or the flight plan page, and it's available on both the PFD and the MFD. You can see if I bring up the direct key, it brings up the field that I want to put something in, and I can use the knobs to enter this just like I did on the old G1000, but you'll notice there's this kind of rectangular square or rectangular symbol to the right of this, got some dots in it, looks kind of like a keyboard. If you click on this and it turns blue, that means that your keyboard can now be used to enter things in the field there. So I can put in KBRY, and now it brings up that that's Bardstown, Kentucky. And then if I want to disengage that, I just click on it again and the blue field disappears, and now I can use my cursor just like I would normally. So this is, again, a very efficient way to load things in there. You just have to be careful. And every time that blue icon is highlighted, that means the keyboard can only be used to enter things into this field. That means the rest of your keyboard functions for any shortcuts you might have set up in Flight Simulator have been disabled until you disengage this. So if you use G to put your gear down or something like that, and you have this enabled, G is not going to put your gear down until you get rid of that. So something to be careful with there. All right, so to enter the flight plan, I'm going to bring up the flight plan page, which I can use the flight plan key, or I can scroll to the flight plan page using the large knobs. I'll just use the flight plan key. Then I want to activate the cursor by pressing the small knob. And what I want to do to enter an origin is use the large knob to go to the blank field underneath the origin field, and then use the small knob to get that cursor field active. Again, I'm going to use the keyboard interface, so I'll click this. It turns blue, so my keyboard is now active for entering data. So I will press KTEL, and then I will hit enter. And it asks me if I want to use a runway or set a runway for departure. I'm not using any runway dependent departure procedures. I'm not using any departure procedures at all, so I don't need to do that. So I will leave none in there and head on to the en route field. To enter en route fixes, again, I want to go to the blank line there that is below en route and twist the small knob to bring the field active. So our first waypoint is going to be cargo, so I'll activate the keyboard and do Charlie, Romeo, Romeo, Golf, Oscar, and then hit enter. That deactivates the field. It has two waypoints listed by that name, and we can take a look. The first one is located, it gives us its lat long, and it gives us our distance from us. So that looks like it. It's about 23 miles on a bearing of 112. That looks to be it. And this is actually a duplicate waypoint because you can see none of the data here has changed. So that's the correct waypoint. We'll go ahead and enter, and now that point is loaded in our flight plan. It automatically moves down to the next blank line, so I will go ahead and roll the small knob to get that field active again. Again, I'll activate the keyboard. Now I want to go to Elizabethtown, so KEKX, and it automatically knows that that is Elizabethtown Airport. So I will hit enter. That's now loaded in the field. Use the small knob to get the data field alive again. Click on the keyboard again. Now we want to go to New Hope VOR, which is Echo Whiskey Oscar. And it gives us again the bearing and distance and the lat longs on that. Even shows us a picture of what's around there. So I'll hit enter. That looks like the correct waypoint, and it loads that. Last waypoint is the destination. So I will go ahead and scroll down to the blank field under destination, use the small knob to get the field active again, and I'll go ahead and use the keyboard to enter my destination. So Kilo Bravo Romeo Yankee, and that is Bardstown Airport in Kentucky. That's what we want. So we will go ahead and hit enter, and it asks us if we want to load a runway. I am eventually going to load an approach, but I can do that en route. So this time I'm not going to load a runway, and it will just take me directly to the airport. And so now our flight plan has been loaded. I can go ahead and click the small button to get the cursor to go away. And then I can click the flight plan key to get the flight plan page to disappear, and I can take a look at our flight plan here. So we do have Tell City, direct to cargo, direct to KEKX, direct to New Hope VOR, and then direct to Bardstown, and then I can pull up the flight plan, and I can see the same thing on the flight plan, and then it gives me my desired track between each point and the distance between each point. Some other things I'll mention about loading flight plans is that you don't necessarily have to have anything in your origin or your destination. You will still have, a valid flight plan that you can navigate on. If you wanted to leave off Tell City and just enter cargo and then go direct to cargo once you get airborne, you could do that. And again, you don't necessarily have to have a destination. You can have KBRY in the last field of the en route, and it will still take you there. You can even still load approaches. You do want to have an origination and a destination if you want to pick up an IFR clearance with air traffic control in Flight Simulator. It will not recognize a full flight plan unless you have both an origination and a destination. So that would be one reason that you would want to include both of those. So with the flight plan entered, all we need to do is set up the rest of the G1000 for any automation we want to use after takeoff. Then it's time to get airborne, and we'll talk about how we get on course. And once I get airborne, I can just turn to intercept my GPS course. I'll put about a 20-degree intercept in here. And then I can arm up the nav, and as soon as the course centers up, it will start to fly that course. We can see the GPS is now armed, and it is currently heading mode, but once the course centers up, it will start to track the GPS course. The other thing I can do now with the NXI is I can redirect. So I'll put it back in heading mode for now. I can just hit enter, and that brings up my direct page, and if I send it direct to anything on my flight plan, it will send it directly to that point and keep everything else on the flight plan. So I hit the direct key, it already pre-populates with cargo. I will hit enter. It will ask, do you want to activate that? And I will say yes. And it redirects from my present position to direct cargo. So that is how the direct feature can work now to redirect you to a point. Let's talk about some ways that you don't want to use the direct feature and how to edit our flight plans. So again, if I use the direct key and I enter anything that's on my flight plan, it will take me directly to that point on my flight plan and keep the rest of the flight plan intact. Another way I can do that is I can go to the flight plan page, I can activate the cursor, and say if I wanted to go to New Hope VOR, I could then highlight New Hope VOR and then hit the direct key, and that would send me direct to New Hope VOR, and again keep the rest of the flight plan intact. But let's say I do not want to remove New Hope. Let's say that I want to go to someplace that is not on my flight plan. Let's say I want to dip down here to 2 India 3, which is an airport on a little lake south of Tell City here. Take a look at the lake, and then I plan to go over to New Hope VOR after that and skip the other two fixes there. What I don't want to do is hit the direct key and then enter 2 India 3 and then hit enter, because if I do that, it will navigate directly to 2 India 3, but it will wipe out everything else in my flight plan. So let's take a look at how we want to do that and keep the rest of our flight plan in there and edit our flight plan. So if I take a look at my flight plan page, I'll see that my flight plan is still in there. So if I want to go direct to something that's on my flight plan, I can just bring up the flight plan, highlight the place I want to go directly to, hit direct, and then hit enter, activate, and it will head me back to my flight plan. So let's talk about ways that we can change the flight plan if we want to add points and things like that. So let's say we want to go to India 3, but after that we want to go to New Hope VOR. So what we'll do here is we will, once it gets on course here, put it into heading mode. So it doesn't change course as it is figuring everything out here. So we'll go ahead and put it into heading mode there. And then what we'll do is we'll bring up the cursor and highlight the field. And what we want to do is we want to highlight the field where we want our next fix to go. So I want to India 3 to go after Tel City. And what that will do is it will insert to India 3 in here, and it will push everything else down. So cargo will be on this line, KEKX, and so on. So I'll roll the small knob to get that field active, and I'll use my keyboard again since that's a little more efficient. Put to India 3 in here, and then hit enter. And now to India 3 is the next point on my flight plan. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move back up to India 3, and I'm going to hit direct. And it says to India 3, is that what you want? I will hit enter, that will bring up activate, hit enter again, and it will take me present position direct to India 3 while leaving everything else in the flight plan. So I still have cargo, KEKX, in New Hope VOR, and then Bardstown. So I want to get rid of cargo and EKX. I want to go directly from to India 3 to New Hope VOR, since we're staying south going down to India 3, and that'll take us well clear of that restricted area that's up here. So all I need to do is highlight the fields that I don't want anymore, and then click clear. So I'll highlight cargo, and then I'll click clear, and it says, do you want to remove cargo from the flight plan? Yes, I do. So I hit enter, and that will remove cargo. I go down and I highlight KEKX, I hit clear, and it says, are you sure you want to do that? I say, yes, I do. And that eliminates that. So now my flight plan is from Tel City, direct to India 3, direct to Echo Whiskey Oscar, and then direct to Bardstown. And then if I click on the flight plan key, that lets the flight plan page go away. So I just see a big picture of the big moving map. And I can see on the moving map that what is listed on the flight plan is what's displayed on the moving map. To India 3, then direct to Echo Whiskey Oscar, and then to Bardstown. Now let's talk about what we need to do if we want to change our destination. So let's say as I'm traveling around along my route here, I get the weather report from Bardstown, and currently they have fog. Maybe they've got a quarter-mile visibility. It doesn't look like I'm going to be able to get in. However, Louisville has decent weather, and they've got some good ILSs up there that we can use. So we're thinking we're probably going to need to go to Louisville, but we'd like to go ahead and overfly Bardstown on our current route, just in case the weather improves. So we're going to leave Bardstown in the flight plan, but we're going to add Louisville as our destination. So this is a little bit different than how it worked in the old stock unit. It used to be we could just tack on Louisville at the end, and Louisville was our new destination. It's not quite as simple on the NXI, but it is more accurate. What we want to do is bring up the flight plan with the flight plan key or with the flight plan page, and then use the small button to activate the cursor. And then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to delete Bardstown as our destination. So I'll go down to Bardstown, I'll hit clear. It says, are you sure you want to do that? I say, yes, I am. And then I hit OK, and now Bardstown is gone from the flight plan. But don't worry, we can bring it back. We'll just go to this empty field right down here. And you can actually enter your destination first if you want to, but we'll enter Bardstown first. And I will activate that field with the small knob. I'll click the keyboard to get it in there, and then I'll go KBRY. And now hit enter, and now Bardstown is back in the flight plan. And then to set Louisville as the destination, I will go in to the destination field, activate the cursor, and then click in KSDF, which is the identifier for Louisville. and it asks if we want a runway. Right now we don't know what they're using, so we will just hit none, and we'll load the approach later. And we can see now we've got 2 India 3, then going over to New Hope, and then over to Bardstown. And then destination is now Louisville. And if I close that flight plan page and back out, then I can see on the moving map it is what I have just entered is in there, 2 India 3, then New Hope, then overflying Bardstown on our way into Louisville. So that's how we want to edit a flight plan if we want to change the destination. On one other bell and whistle that I'd like to show off that the NXI does is if you highlight your cursor and you bring it down to an airport that has weather reporting, it will give you the current weather for that airport. So here's the current weather for Louisville. It will do that for, I believe, any airport that has weather reporting. The thing to be aware on this is that this is the current real-world weather at that airport. It is not what you have in flight simulators. So if you're using anything other than live weather, this is not going to be accurate. All right, so as we progress on towards Bardstown, looking out the window, we can see that we have developed a undercast out here, and we talked to air traffic control, and they say that there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is that Bardstown is still IFR. It's still below minimums to shoot the approach to get in there, and we are going to have to shoot an approach to get in there, an instrument approach to get in there, but the visibility does seem to be improving. So they ask us, do you want to continue to go to Louisville and attempt an approach up there, or do you want to stay down in this area maybe and hold, say, at New Hope VOR and wait to see if the visibility improves and see if we can get in an instrument approach up at Bardstown. So we take a look at our fuel status. We still have 3/4 of a tank, still got about 3 hours worth of fuel on board and probably 2 hours with reserves. So yeah, we've got time that we could hang out at New Hope, do a holding pattern, and potentially get into Bardstown rather than having to divert up to Louisville. So we went ahead and we took Louisville out of our flight plan. We put Bardstown back into our destination. Let's talk about how to set up a hold in the G1000 NXI. So we'll assume as we approach New Hope VOR, the ATC issues us the following clearance. You're cleared direct to the New Hope VOR. Hold west of the New Hope VOR on the 270 degree radial. You can maintain 5,500 VFR on top and expect further clearance in 30 minutes. So how do we set up this hold in the G1000? What we want to do is go back to the flight plan menu, and then we will highlight the fix that we want to hold at. In this case, it's going to be New Hope, so we'll move the cursor over New Hope VOR, and then we'll hit the menu key, and that brings up some options for us. One of the options, the fourth one down here, is hold at waypoint. So we'll highlight that, and then we will press enter, and then we will decide on our course. We can select inbound or outbound. Outbound would be what we want if we want a radial. Or we could actually select inbound and do the reciprocal. I'm actually going to do that. So if we want to hold on the 270 degree radial, that's going to be a 090 course inbound. So we will do that. And so we've adjusted that. We've adjusted that so it's inbound. He didn't say anything on the leg length, so that we need to assume that that is a 1 minute holding pattern. But if we wanted to, we could ask for 2 minute holding pattern. We can actually change this over to distance, and we could do things like airliners will usually ask for something like 10 or 15 mile legs, so their legs are fairly long and they don't have to turn all the time. They can do a little bit longer leg lengths, but we'll just stick with the standard. And then we can change the pattern direction down in this field down here. He did not specify a direction, so we assume it's a standard holding pattern to the right, but if he had told us left turns, we can go in there, we can change it to left turns. So all of that looks good. We'll go ahead and enter. We'll scroll down to the load field. It says you want to load this holding pattern, and we will say yes and hit enter. And so it now has the hold in there after Echo Whiskey Oscar intersection. I'll click the flight plan button to get the map zoomed in here, and you can see it has the hold actually depicted, and then it will do the correct entry into that holding pattern as well. It will do, in this case, it's going to be a direct pattern entry, but if they were to say change the pattern over to this side and we needed to do a teardrop or parallel entry, it will do the entry correctly there. And as you can see, as it passes over the New Hope VOR, it starts the turn to the outbound leg of the hold. It's got about let's see here. And it should activate the holding pattern here in just a second. And there, the holding pattern is now the active portion. And you notice the other thing that's happened now is we have gone into suspension mode. So when you are in a holding pattern, it says, I don't know when you want to leave this holding pattern. I will stay in the holding pattern until you tell me to get out of here. And so it's entered suspension mode, and we can leave the holding pattern and go by to the next fix by hitting the suspension soft key, and then when it finishes up the next leg of the holding pattern, it'll go to New Hope VOR, and then it'll continue up to Bardstown after that. So once we get clearance, that's how we want to exit the holding pattern. So as we turn outbound on one of our legs of holding, we receive a message from ATC, and they tell us that the weather is improving at Bardstown, and we can expect to head up there momentarily to shoot the approach. They say to expect to depart New Hope direct to FAMRU, and to expect the RNAV GPS to runway 21 up in Bardstown. So we can go ahead and load that in our flight plan. So to load an instrument approach, what we want to do is hit the procedure key, and that will bring up a menu box will bring up the procedure page with several options. We want to select an approach, which is the first one that is highlighted there. So we will hit enter, and then it brings up our approach options and highlights the field there. And so we take a look at our options here, and what we want is the RNAV GPS to 21, which is also an LPV approach. So we will go ahead and highlight that and hit enter, and then it asks us how we want to get into it. Vectors is just going to put a straight line off the final approach fix that we can get vectored onto, and then we have the option, and you'll see as we highlight each of these options, it will actually highlight what we're looking at. So if ESIV is going to be over to the east side, that is not what we want. That's not what he told us we were going to get. FAMRU is the one that we want. It shows us we'll go FAMRU, and then we'll turn into OX4, and then turn in and fly the approach from there. And then if I select OX4 as the initial approach fix, if I come from this direction, I'm going to end up actually flying that procedure turn. So it depicts that procedure turn, that holding pattern procedure turn. So that's not what I want to do. I want to do FAMRU. And also to choose to fly something like a DME arc or a teardrop procedure, you would just choose the fix where that procedure starts. So that's how that works, and we'll talk about that more here in just a second. So FAMRU is where I want to go, so I'll go ahead and press enter. And then I can go ahead and load my minimums here. I can also do it from the timer reference page, or excuse me, from the minimums page on the primary flight display, but this is a handy time to do it. I won't forget about it if I do that later. So what I want to do is I want to use the small wheel to turn this to the barrel minimums. I don't have any other options on the 172 than barrel and off because we do not have a radar altimeter, although if an aircraft has a radar altimeter, you'll also see a option to do radar altimeter, radar minimums. That's typically used for Cat 2 and 3 ILSs only, so typically it's not something you're going to use unless you're shooting one of those, but that will be an option on radar altimeter equipped aircraft. And then the minimums on this are 919 for the LPV approach. This will only do it in 10, so you always want to round up to the next highest 10 because the MDA is something you never want to go below. So we will scroll it up to 910. Excuse me, 920. So that's set in there now. I'll press enter, and it goes down to the next field. And I'll take a look over here, and you can see the little half of the radar or the minimum bug is sticking on there to let me know that I do have minimum set right now. And then we have to scroll down here to the bottom to get our two options. We have the option to load, which will place it at the end of our flight plan. That's what we want to do since we haven't been cleared to go anywhere yet. If you would activate, that will actually send you directly from your present position to the approach, the first fix on the approach. So we want to load it into the flight plan, and that's what we'll do. And you can see we're currently still in the hold. Then we're going to go to Bardstown Airport, and then we will go after that up to FAMRU. And you can see if I get rid of the flight plan page, that's what we want to have in here. We'll zoom it back a little bit so we can see things. It shows us going in the hold and then direct to Bardstown Airport and then out to FAMRU. And then once we get cleared out of the hold, then we can go ahead and activate the approach and go directly from our present position to FAMRU to flight the approach. So before we take a look at Vnav and actually shoot this approach, let's talk about how we can load the other types of procedures that were not available in the old G1000. Again, we elected to load up FAMRU as our initial approach fix and just fly up to FAMRU, hang a right, and fly the approach in that way. But we can also select to do the procedure turn, the holding pattern type procedure turn that's up here at Ox4. And we would do that by just loading the loading Ox4 as our initial fix instead of FAMRU. We saw that available in the options, and if we did that, then that would load navigation. So we'd fly up to Ox4, fly that holding pattern procedure turn, and then proceed in on the approach that way. You can also load up traditional approaches like ILSs and VOR approaches and even NDB approaches in the database, and then you can fly the procedures to get you from those initial fixes to your final approach fixes there. And again, the way you do it is you just load up the approach fix that you want for that particular transition. So right now we're looking at the ILS to runway 8 into Fort Smith. So if I loaded this up, one of the initial approach fixes that would be available to me would be a Ouija, which would have me fly this DME arc here on the north side. So I could fly a DME arc with the GPS loading up that fix. Or if I was coming in from the south side of this airport and I wanted to fly the southern arc down here, then I will load up a Vuzu as the initial approach fix. Another type of procedure that's now available is that teardrop type procedure turn. We're looking at the ILS to runway 18 into Pine Bluff. And if I wanted to fly this charted teardrop procedure here, I would want to load up the Pine Bluff VOR as my initial approach fix. And you can see there's also two DME arcs that are also available on this approach. And if I wanted to load up the Eastern arc, I would load ITEL as the initial approach fix. And if I wanted to load the Western arc, then I would load IUNI. So that's how you can load and fly those procedures that were not available in the G1000. They are now available in the NXI. And as we make our turn inbound towards New Hope, ATC calls us up and says, looks like you're good to go into Bardstown. So here's your clearance. Reaching New Hope, you are cleared direct to Bardstown. Or cleared to Bardstown via direct, maintain 5,500. So we're cleared out of the hold. What we want to do is go over and hit to the primary flight display and hit the suspension slough key, and that will put it back into normal sequencing. And once we reach New Hope, it should start heading on its own directly to Bardstown. And we can see as it reaches New Hope, it starts a turn to the left, and it has activated the direct leg to Bardstown. ATC calls us back up, and they say you are cleared direct to FAMRU, cross FAMRU at 3000, and that you are cleared for the RNAV GPS runway 21. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my flight plan. I'm going to highlight FAMRU. And then I'm going to hit direct. It says loads FAMRU. It says, is that where you want to go? Do we want to activate? Yes, we do. Just to mention, hold is actually, if you were to do that, it brings up the holding page. You could actually set up a hold at FAMRU, but that's not what we want to do right now. We want to go direct and fly the approach. So that's what we're going to do. But that's another way you can enter a holding pattern, is go direct to the fix you want to hold at, and then instead of hitting activate, hit hold. So we want to go direct to FAMRU. We'll hit enter, and you can see we are now navigating direct to FAMRU. Now let's talk a little bit about Vnav. All right, so to look at the Vnav, we will pull up the flight plan page again, and you'll notice that for any arrival or approach segment that you will have some altitudes listed off to the side, and this is for the Vnav. Currently, the white numbers are not editable. They're just advisory to tell you that in order to cross the next fix at the altitude that's in there, this is where you're going to cross that fix that it has listed in white there, what altitude you're going to cross that at. But they are not editable. The ones in blue are actually editable, and what you can do is you can go in here and just use the big cursor. You hit the little knob to get the cursor field active, and then use the big knob to scroll the cursor, and you can see instead of scrolling fix to fix, it scrolls to fix and then over to the altitude, and then you can go and wiggle the small knob, and that will get the small cursor activated, and then you can go in and you can use the big knob to move where the little cursor is, and you can use the small knob to change the value in there. You don't want to put anything lower than what's on a procedure. For example, in this procedure, it says on the segment that goes from Oxford to Undos, minimum altitude is 3,000 feet. So we don't want to make it any lower than that, and you do want to be cognizant of how high you make it relative to your next fix. We only have 6 nautical miles to get down from whatever we selected Oxford to 2,500 feet at Undos. So you do want to be careful how you edit that. We'll give another example when we do our second more complicated flight plan. We'll just leave this one at 3,000 now. And we'll assume that we got an amended clearance that they said proceed direct to FAMRU, descend at pilot's discretion, cross Oxford at 3,000 feet, and you are cleared for the RNAV GPS runway 21 at Samuels Field at Bardstown. So if I get out of the flight plan page, you'll see that it brings up on the map a top of descent point here that tells us in order to make Oxford at 3,000, this is where we need to start down. And then as we get closer to that top of descent point, it will actually give us some vertical guidance over here on the VSI, and it'll actually pop up a little vertical guidance path to the left of the altimeter where we would normally have a glide slope or a glide path for an approach. We can't go into the flight plan and see the top of descent in the flight plan like we can with an FMS. So that is one limitation there. We don't know what distance it is away from us, but we can make kind of a estimate based on where it is in relation to our range circle. So I can zoom out and I can see it's a little less than 15 nautical miles. It's a little more than 10 nautical miles. So it's probably about, I'd say about 12 or 13 miles away from us right now. So as we're flying on the downwind here, before we begin the descent, let's take a look at what is in here for the approach. Like we mentioned earlier, right now it tracks up to the initial approach fix at FAMRU, then it turns inbound to Oxford, then it makes the right turn to Undos, which is the final approach fix, and this is where we capture our actual glide path for the approach, and we'll put it into approach mode prior to Undos. That will track laterally and vertically all the way to runway 21, which is our missed approach point. And you can see after that, the missed approach procedure is in here, but it is thin right now, which means it is not going to be active. It won't activate automatically. We will plan on going missed approach, so you can see how this works. And what will happen is when it hits the missed approach point, which in this case is designated runway 21 or RW21, it will go into suspension mode, and in order to be able to track the rest of this path here, I've got to take it out of suspension mode. So that's what's going to happen in the missed approach point. When you're flying when you're flying a instrument approach, if you do have to go missed approach, if you're prior to the missed approach point, you still want to fly laterally to the missed approach point before you start any sort of missed approach procedure. So you do want to hit that point. You can start climbing prior to that. You just don't want to deviate laterally from the approach until you hit that point, because if you go off to the side before that, you're not guaranteed obstacle clearance. So that's kind of a rundown of how the missed approach will work, and again, we'll demonstrate that once we get down there. We'll fly the approach until we can see the runway, and then we'll say something's pulled out in the runway in front of us and we have to go around, and then we'll demonstrate flying the missed approach procedure. So you can see as I got within about 2 miles of the top of descent point, it starts to put a vertical path up there and a guidance on the vertical speed indicator. In order for it to track the vertical path, I need to set my altitude to what the next constraint is, which is aux4 at 3000. It also tells me up here what my next constraint is at on the FMS, so it is at 3000. And then what I can do is I can arm the Vnav, just like I would arm a glide slope for an approach. And we can see up here in the automated flight system status display up here, it shows that Vnav path is armed. So once this Vnav path comes down here and centers up on the middle of the glide slope here, the GPS will automatically command the autopilot to track this path. You can see it is going into Vnav path right now. So all I have to do is pull back the power a little bit to keep the speed where I want it, and it will automatically track this path all the way down to reaching aux4 at 3000. Some other things I'll mention about the Vnav path is you can see in here that you have a vertical speed target in here, so it tells you what vertical speed that you need, and it also tells you what your flight path angle will be. We're doing a 3-degree glide slope or glide path down on this path right now. You can actually go in there and you can edit this by going down into the Vnav. Sorry, I think you have to use the Vnav Pro soft key here, and you can actually make this more than 3 degrees or less than 3 degrees if you want a steeper or shallower descent. And when you do that, you'll actually see your top of descent, if you haven't reached it yet, will move on you based on where you want to start that descent. Currently, you can't edit the vertical speed target. That is computed by the system, and even though it's blue, there's no way to change that. So that is how the Vnav works, and we can follow the Vnav down all the way to 2500, which is our crossing at Undos, which is our final approach fix for the RNAV GPS approach to 21 here to Bardstown. And you can see as it comes down here and makes the turn, it captures the altitude. It's now an altitude hold of 3,000 feet. And as soon as it changes my constraint to 3,000 or to 2,500, I can go ahead and roll this down to 2,500. I can reactivate the Vnav path. Actually, it doesn't seem like that's working, so I'll just use vertical speed. Small vertical speed down, say 500 feet a minute. I'll go ahead and get it down to 2,500, and then we'll arm it up for the approach. All right, so I am level at 2,500 feet, about 3 miles from Undos, which is my final approach fix. The GPS mode, it's currently in GPS mode, which means it's going to track all the way to the runway. So that portion of the approach is already taken care of. But in order for it to track the glide path that this approach has and that the GPS will generate for me, I need to arm the approach mode. So I'll go ahead and do that, and we can see that glide path is now armed, and I will see that glide path start to come down here in just a few miles, and once it centers up, the aircraft will start to track that. You can see there is the glide path now. I'm no longer in Vnav path mode. I've taken it out of that. Even though there's a Vnav path there, it won't track that. And the big difference between those two modes is that in Vnav path, it will always honor what is in here. It will stop at those altitudes, versus as the glide path, it is going to automatically capture this glide path and track it regardless of what's in here. So it will not stop at any intermediate altitudes. Coming up on 1 mile from the approach, I'm going to go ahead and set the missed approach altitude of 3,100 feet in the altitude pre-select window, so I'm ready for that. And I'm going to go ahead and start configuring the aircraft for the approach and getting on approach speed. So again, the glide slope is going to center up here, and the aircraft will start to track the glide slope down. There we can see the glide path has gone into capture. And once it's solid green, we know that it's tracking. And all I have to do now is manage the configuration and the throttle to manage my speed. All right, so I am fully configured. I've got flaps 30, I've got my landing checklist complete, and I'm just tracking, allowing the GPS to track both the lateral path to the runway and the glide path to the runway, and I will track that all the way down to the minimums. You can also see that the CDI has gone to LPV scaling. LPV or LP means that it is localizer performance. That means that the width of this course from the center of the CDI needle to full scale deflection was 0.3 nautical miles at undos at the final approach fix, but then it narrows down to about 700 feet each side of the course when we get to the missed approach point or when we get to the runway threshold. So again, that's another feature of the NXI, is that correct CDI scaling. And you can see once the altitude where my bug is set is displayed on the tape, that bug starts to rise up with that altitude. So I know that my minimums are getting somewhat close. So about 100 feet above, I'll take a look out and see if we can see the runway. And then we'll have some sort of imaginary vehicle pop onto the runway, and we'll have to do a go around and a missed approach. So there is 100 feet above the runway. We'll go ahead and take a look out, and we can see the runway end identifier lights. I don't want to go below my minimums with the autopilot on, so I will go ahead and turn the autopilot off. We'll get just a little bit closer here. And then as we get down almost to the surface, we see somebody has pulled out onto the runway. I can't land on top of them, so I'm going to execute a missed approach. I'll go full power. I'll push up to about 10 degrees. I'll pull the flaps up to 10 degrees. And you'll notice that I'm going to navigate to this missed approach point. And once I get to the missed approach point, it's going to go into suspension mode, and I'm going to have to, there it went into suspension mode, so it's no longer giving me lateral guidance. I'm going to go ahead and put it into a flight level change mode here on the flight director, and that'll give me good pitch guidance so I don't over pitch here and get a little too slow. Once I get above 500 feet, I can go ahead and put it back on the autopilot mode, and I'm going to take it out of suspension mode, and you can see now it's giving me lateral guidance to fly that missed approach procedure. It's still in the GPS mode, so it centers it right on back up. And I am navigating on this missed approach. It's just straight out to the missed approach hold. So it's got the path out to that missed approach hold. It will fly me all the way out there, and then it will actually enter the hold for me. And then it will stay in that hold as long as I tell it not to do something else. So that's how the missed approach sequence works there. And you can see all I'm having to worry about right now is it is flying the vertical mode that I've set right now, which is flight level change. I'll get that down to 74 knots for the best rate of climb. And it's flying the lateral path. All I need to worry about is when it levels off, I'm going to need to pull the throttle back. But other than that, everything else is taken care of for me. So there it's gone to altitude capture, and it will go into altitude hold mode here just shortly. And as it does that, all I need to do is monitor the airspeed, make sure that the autopilot's doing what it's supposed to do. And when it gets to about 105 knots, I'll pull the power back to my cruise power. And then it's just going to fly me out to that holding pattern, enter the holding pattern, and then keep me in that holding pattern until I make an entry and tell it what it needs to go do next. Another thing that's kind of cool about this, you can see it with this holding pattern, is it going from this direction and holding at marks at the missed approach holding point. From this, we're going to have to do a teardrop entry. And with a teardrop entry, you hit the point, you fly a 45 degree angle to intercept the outbound leg, and then you turn back around to fly inbound to the fix, and then you start your holding pattern. And all that is visually depicted for us, so we can take a look. You know, we should still do our mental assessment of which type of holding pattern entry we should do, but it's nice that it gives us a visual depiction of, hey, here is how you're going to enter the holding pattern. And again, it will fly out to the holding pattern, it will enter the holding pattern, and it will stay in that holding pattern until you tell it to do something else. And you'll notice when it entered the missed approach hold, it went into suspension mode again. And again, it will keep me in that hold until I take it out of suspension mode. And if I want to exit the hold, there's a couple different ways I can do that. I can just deselect the suspension mode, and it will continue on the flight plan. The only thing left in the flight plan is for it to go back to my destination, because that's the next thing and the last thing on the flight plan. But I could load another approach from there. We'll probably just vector out here off to the west and set up for actually a visual approach, and we'll demonstrate how that works. But I'll go ahead and let it turn inbound here, and then I'll take it out of suspension mode so you can see how that works. All right, so I'm on the inbound leg to the holding approach fix, and so I'm going to go ahead and take it out of suspension mode, and it's gone back into normal sequencing. So we should see it hit this point, and then it should go directly to Bardstown from there, since that's the last point in our flight plan. And we could go into the flight plan, we could change the destination, we could put another point in there that it could go to, we could reload an approach. There's a number of different things that we could do depending on what we need to do, where we need to go next. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put it in heading mode after it shows that it'll go to Bardstown, and we'll say that we're getting vectors for another approach, and then miraculously the weather is going to clear to good VFR weather, and we're going to be able to get in visually, and we'll show you how a visual approach works on the G1000. Okay, so important point, it passed the point, and it did not go to the next point in the flight plan, which is our destination. So in order to do that, we will actually have to enter that manually. So I'm going to go ahead and go into a heading hold mode. We'll say that ATC came up and said, hey, turn left, fly a heading of 300. Weather seems to be approving if you want to try another approach. And then we'll get the clear weather here just shortly, and we'll show you how to set up for a visual approach and how that works. All right, so we've flown out to the northwest just a little bit here, and we take a look outside, and look, the fog has miraculously lifted to clear VFR conditions, so we can get into Bardstown with a visual approach. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the direct key just to load up Bardstown as our point. So I'll use the keyboard, go KBRY, and then enter, and then activate. I'm in heading hold mode right now, so it's not going to try to track that. And then the way I want to load up a visual approach is I want to hit procedure, and then I want to go to select approach, and then I will look for the visuals are always at the bottom. So I want a visual to runway 21. And what a visual approach does on the GPS is it sets up a point that is in line with the runway's center line, roughly 2.5 miles from the end of the runway, and then it sets up a vertical point about 700 to 800 feet at that point, and will give you vertical guidance both to that point and from that point to the runway threshold. So I'll go ahead and select a visual to runway 21. I'll hit enter. It gives me the option of vectors. What that's going to do is it's going to take that point called straight, or it's going to take a point that point that's 2.5 nautical miles out there, and it will extend it all the way, I believe, out to infinity, and you can steer yourself on that. Or you can do the straight approach, which is going to give you guidance from your present position then along the most optimal lateral and vertical path to that point. So it's a very nice feature that allows you to go, just arm the Vnav and arm the lateral navigation, and it'll basically fly you in the most efficient way from your present position to that point, and then give you guidance from that point to the runway. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. We don't need baro minimums on this one, so I'll go ahead and turn those off since this is not actually an instrument approach. And then hit enter. Actually, we'll just have to scroll down to activate. And it gives you a little disclaimer here that, even though it's giving you vertical guidance, it does not assure you that that's going to provide obstacle clearance. It assumes that you are not in the clouds and that you can see the obstacles and avoid them. And we'll acknowledge that. And you can see, if we turn our flight plan on, it gives us a turn around to that point, and then it gives us that point to the runway there. And so we'll go ahead and arm the nav and let it fly on around. And you can see it's also given us a top of descent point there. So as we get closer to that top of descent point, it's going to give us vertical guidance basically all the way to the runway. As you can see, as we get within about 5 miles or so of the top of descent, it starts to pop up a glide path here. It'll give us, actually be vertical guidance at first, and then it'll transition over to being a glide path when we arm the approach mode. So what I'm going to do is it tells us our constraint right now is 1030, and that's at the final approach point. So I'm going to go ahead and load up 1100 feet in my altitude pre-selector. Probably could have done that a little faster with the big knob. And then I will go ahead and arm the Vnav path. And you can see that the Vnav path is armed, so once that starts coming down, it is going to go ahead and capture the path and fly that path down. And all I have to do is manage the throttle initially for the speed as it tracks that path down towards the runway. And you can see now that the vertical path has come alive, and so once it centers up on the glide path indicator there, the aircraft will go ahead and track it. And again, all I have to do is adjust the throttle to keep my speed. So we can see the Vnav path has centered up there. It has indicated that it is now actively tracking the Vnav path. So all I need to do is adjust the throttle, and then once it turns onto final, I can arm the approach mode, and it will start tracking it as a glide path rather than a vertical Vnav guidance path. And then it doesn't matter what I put in there. It will basically fly it all the way to the ground if I let it. I, again, probably need to turn off the autopilot at 500 feet or so on the approach. Technically, it is an approach, so, you know, I guess you could go down as low as 200 feet. I don't know what the guidance is exactly on that. So, but my technique has been to turn it off at 500 feet and fly it manually. But the aircraft is capable of flying it basically all the way to the runway. It won't do any sort of flare, so it'll smash you onto the runway if you don't turn it off before then. But mechanically, it will track it all the way basically to the surface. As we approach about 1,000 feet above the airport elevation, I'm going to go ahead and start configuring the aircraft and getting it slowed to the approach speed. And again, all I have to do is manage configuration and throttle to keep myself on speed. The aircraft is doing the rest of the work for me. It's tracking the lateral path that's displayed here on the moving map, and it's tracking the vertical path that is displayed on the the glide path indication here. And you can see it started to turn around to final here. And again, you don't need to be, you know, just looking inside while you're doing this. This is a visual approach. It'd be fine to be looking outside. I've just got it focused on the G1000 so you can see, you know, how the G1000 indicates and what it does as we fly this approach. All right, so it's made the turn to that final segment. Again, this straight point is about 2.5 miles from the runway, and that's what it bases both its lateral and vertical guidance on. So since we're lined up now, I'll go ahead and arm the approach mode, and you can see when I do that, it changes the vertical path guidance to an actual glide path, so now it will not stop the descent at 1,100 feet. It'll go ahead and track it all the way down if I want it to do that. Since it is visual, I'm going to go ahead and take a look outside, and you can see it's flying a pretty good glide path out here. It's, I believe, looks like we've got a PAPI there. It looks like we have 2 reds and 2 whites, so it's doing a really good job. And this makes it easy to fly a nice smooth approach really to any airport in the country that even if it doesn't have a instrument approach. If you're in visual conditions, you can get good guidance down to the runway. This is also really handy for airports that don't have any sort of PAPI or VASI. If you want some vertical guidance, you can set it up with this visual approach, and you get yourself an electronic glide slope. Again, it doesn't guarantee obstacle clearance. You still have to use your eyes and look outside, but it works really well. I've tried it multiple times, and it'll guide you right down to the runway. Pretty much every time it sets up a nice approach path. Just be aware that it is not flying any sort of traffic pattern, so you're not necessarily adhering to traffic pattern rules when you're flying this sort of visual approach. All right, for our second route, we're going to do one that's a little more complicated, that has a standard instrument departure, some airways in it, and a standard terminal arrival route, so we can see how to load those up. The route is going to be from Spirit of St. Louis Airport in the St. Louis, Missouri area down to Addison Airport in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. And the route of flight today is going to be the Lindy 8 departure, which is a SID out of Spirit of St. Louis. The Lindy 8 departure to the Vichy transition, and then we will fly Victor 289 all the way down to Fort Smith VOR, then Victor 13 down to Rich Mountain VOR, then Victor 315 down to Paris VOR, and from there we will pick up the Paris transition to the Finger 7 arrival into the Dallas-Fort Worth area and into Addison, and we will plan on flying the RNAV GPS to runway 16 from the Finger transition onto that approach. Since this flight leg is 500 miles, a little bit longer, we will upgrade our aircraft. We're going to fly in the DA-62, the Diamond Twin Superstar, and we're going to cruise at 8,000 feet for this westbound route. So to set up for this flight, I'm going to select the Diamond DA-62. You'll notice by this little slant there that I do have the DA-62 mod installed, so if the performance looks a little different than what you're getting in the sim, that's probably what's going on there. I do highly recommend that mod. It makes this a much better, much more flyable airplane. For the weight and balance, I am going to go ahead and load up full tanks, 2 full wing tanks and 2 full aux tanks. So we'll have a good amount of range on the aircraft. And then we will select our departure as KSUS, which is Spirit of St. Louis. I'm going to depart off runway 26 left. If you want to set it up on the ramp, that's fine. I'll just go ahead and set up on the runway so we don't have to worry about start. Again, I won't input the route. I'm going to do that in the flight plan. And then as far as time, I'm going to go ahead and do a mid-April day, about 9 o'clock in the morning again. And I might insert some IFR weather as the flight progresses so we can do a good instrument approach once we get down there. But for now, I'll probably just leave it VFR. So we'll go ahead and click on fly, and let's see how to set up this route. All right, so I'm on the runway at Spirit of St. Louis, and I start the flight plan just like I would any other flight plan by entering the origination point. And then after that, I want to load a standard instrument departure. So I go into my procedures just like I would for an approach. And rather than going to select approach, I go down to select departure. And then it brings up a list of all the departures that are available from this airport. I want the Lindy 8. And then I will hit enter, and then I have to select where I want to go because that departure has multiple end routes or end points. I want to go to Vichy. That's the transition I want. And you can see when I do that, it puts up the route on there. This particular transition goes from the St. Louis VOR down to Clare and down to Vichy. It also goes from St. Louis, Spirit of St. Louis up to St. Louis VOR, which we don't want to do, but we'll talk about how we work around that once we get in the air. So that's what I want. I'll hit enter, and then it lists all the points here that make up that departure, and that all looks correct. So I will go ahead and hit load. And that's got all of that loaded in my flight plan. If I hit the flight plan key, I can back up and I can see, again, St. Louis, Spirit of St. Louis Airport up to St. Louis, then down to Clare. And if I zoom out a little bit more, it goes all the way down to Vichy. Again, we're going to have to do some workarounds here to get ourselves on course once we get airborne. Since we don't want to fly up to St. Louis VOR, go north to go south, we don't want to do that. ATC probably doesn't want us to do that. But once we get airborne, we'll talk about how we're going to work that out. All right, so now let's look at how to load airways. So to load an airway, what I want to do is hit the flight plan key, and then I want to get the cursor field active, and then I want to scroll down to the empty field underneath the last fix I have on the flight plans. In this case, Vichy is the last fix that I had loaded. I want to go down to this little blank line in the en route section right now, and then I want to hit menu. And that brings up the option to load airway. That's highlighted already. If it wasn't, I would need to move the cursor there. I'll hit enter. And then I will scroll with the small key and it will list every airway that comes off of Vichy or goes through Vichy. So I want Victor 289, so I scroll down to Victor 289, but you notice it'll list every airway. It'll list the Tango Airways, it'll list the Victor Airways. If there's Jet Airways that go through there, I assume it lists those too, probably. So I just have to scroll through until I find the airway that I want. I found 289, I'll highlight that and hit enter. And you notice it automatically loads the entry point for that airway as Vichy. Then it says Victor 289, okay, exit. How far do you want to take this airway? Because it starts north of Vichy and it goes well south of Vichy. So where do you want to take this airway to? And I want to take it to Fort Smith VOR. And you can see this starts all the way down, and I think that's Beaumont, Texas. And I assume it goes a fair amount north. It goes through, looks like Tyler, Texas. So I need to go through, I want to take it to Fort Smith, so I just have to scroll through this big list until I find Fort Smith VOR. There it is. I highlight that and I hit enter. And then it lists all the points that are going to be on that airway once I load this up. So if we were to look at the chart, we can see that Victor 289 goes from Vichy to Zorab to Bacta to Peckley to Gobi, Mupai, or Muppy, I guess, Monday, Dogwood VOR, Harrison VOR, Marby VOR, Maids, Casks, Mulry, and then I can use the big cursor to scroll down further in the field to see the rest of the fixes. See Mulby, Figs, and then Fort Smith. So I can compare that to my chart. It looks good. I highlight the load field and then I hit enter. And then you can see on the flight plan, it has loaded all of those fixes in there. So I didn't have to go through and load every single fix on that airway. I didn't have to cheat and use just the points where the airway turns. The entire airway is loaded now for me. So much more efficient than it was, much more like an FMS, and much more efficient than it was in the old G1000. Of course, I'm not done yet. I still have a few more airways to load, so I go down to Fort Smith and I go to the next blank point underneath that. I hit menu again. I highlight load airway, hit enter again, and then it says, okay, you want to enter an airway from Fort Smith. Which airway do you want? I use the small knob to scroll down, and I want Victor 13 from Fort Smith. And then it takes it a little while to process here. I'll go down, or it automatically shifts down. It says, where do you want to exit that airway? So I want to exit that airway at Rich Mountain, which is Papa Golf Oscar. So I'll scroll down until I find Papa Golf Oscar. These aren't listed in any sort of order that I can tell. So there is Papa Golf Oscar. I will hit enter. It tells me that if I'm going on that airway, there's the points on that airway. So I'll double check those against the chart to make sure they're accurate. And if I like that, then I'll go ahead and load it. And now if I were to scroll down again, I can see that those points are now loaded into the flight plan. Now I just want to load Victor 13. So again, I go to that low point, that empty point on the en route section, menu, whoops, load airway, yes, enter. And then from Rich Mountain, I want Victor 315. There's not many airways that come off of Rich Mountain, so don't have to scroll through much there. And then my exit point is going to be Paris VOR, which is the only way. This is a very short airway and with only one point. And it tells me the sequence on this airway is Rich Mountain direct to Paris. I could load that up as a direct leg if I wanted to, but if my clearance was via the Victor airway, it's better to load it, with the Victor airway. That way, if there is a point that I'm not seeing, I won't miss that point. Go ahead and load that up. And now if I scroll down, I can see that that is in the flight plan as well. Another couple of features I want to point out here. You'll notice that this is a really long flight plan now. It's hard to look at. It's hard to see the entire flight plan. So another option I can do is to go into the menu and go to Collapse Airways. And that will collapse the airways so that it lists them in a more concise format. So we can see the Vichy departure, and then Victor 289 to Fort Smith, Victor 13 to PGO, and then Victor 315 to Paris. And it tells me it's collapsed, and if I want to uncollapse it, I just go back into the menu and hit Expand Airways, and we'll expand all those points once again. So that is how you load airways. Now let's talk about how to load our arrival procedure. All right, so the last thing I need to do to complete the flight plan is enter a destination, and I need to enter the arrival procedure. So to the enter the destination, it's the same as we did in the simple flight plan. Go down to the blank line underneath destination, highlight that field, and then use the small knob to get that field active. Then I will go ahead and enter my destination, KADS, and there that is. So I will hit enter, and now that is in my field. Let's see here, I got a you can choose to load up a runway. We'll be loading an approach here towards the end of the flight plan, so we will not do that at this time. And we can see that now our destination of Addison is in there. In order to load the arrival, we go to procedures, just like we did for our departure, and we select arrival. And then it will bring up all the possible arrivals once we go down to the arrival field here. You can see usually it will populate this with your destination airport, but if it doesn't, you can go in and change it to your destination airport. So we'll go down to the arrival field, use the small knob to scroll through what's available. The one we want is the finger 7, which is the second one that's listed there. So we'll enter there, and then it says, where do you want to start this arrival from? And again, if you change this, it'll show you all the different ways that you can fly this arrival and all the different points you can originate from on this arrival. We want Paris, so we'll go ahead and hit enter, and then it lists all the fixes for us. So if we're flying in from Paris, it's going to go over Monty after Paris, and then ropes, and then the finger intersection, and then it has a vector 230 heading that you fly after finger, and it just puts a point in there that's not actually on the arrival to make it fly that heading. So all that looks correct, and we'll go ahead and load that up. And if we scroll down, and get our cursor field active first. If we scroll down here on the flight plan, we'll be able to see the arrival is now loaded in there, and the destination is also loaded in there too. So everything looks good to go. We'll just come back up here and we will set up our aircraft and set up the autopilot for departure, and we will get airborne and get on our way to Dallas. Okay, so we are airborne out of St. Louis and climbing out to our altitude of 8,000 feet. Now we have to decide how we're going to get on course. The problem that we have is we have a leg that goes from Spirit of St. Louis up to St. Louis VOR, and we don't want to fly that. ATC will most likely not have us fly that. They would either give us vectors onto course and tell us to join the departure, or they would give us direct to Claire and then just have us resume on navigation. So really your two options in the G1000 is to manually steer yourself onto this white line and then go direct to Claire and engage your nav, or you can just go present position direct to whatever fix you'd like to go to on the departure and do that. I'm going to choose the latter, so I'll go ahead and go to flight plan. And remember that you want to use your flight plan to go direct to something. Well, I mean, you could enter Claire in there. You just want to enter something that's not in your flight plan, or it will clear out your flight plan. So there's Claire. I will go ahead and hit direct. That's where I want to go. Enter and activate, and it sends me direct to Claire, and I can go ahead and engage the nav. And I am off and en route to Addison, Texas. So we'll climb up to our cruising altitude. We will assume that we are not going to get any major changes along the route, so we will skip that part and rejoin once we get onto the arrival down there in Paris. So after an uneventful en route flight, I am approaching Monty intersection, which is getting close to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I'm handed off to Dallas-Fort Worth approach, and they tell me welcome aboard and expect the RNAV GPS runway 16 at Addison from finger intersection. So with that information, I can go ahead and load up my approach. So I'll zoom in over here to the multifunction display, and to load the approach, it's the same as we did up in Bardstown. We just hit procedure, select approach. I want the RNAV GPS to runway 16. The LPV will work great. So I will hit enter on that, and then it says, where do you want to start this approach from? And I want to start it from the finger intersection. It shows me that I'll go from finger to Manos, and then to Sornay, and then Bono, and on in the approach that way. So that's what I want, and I will go ahead and hit enter on that. I'll turn the baro minimums on, and the baro minimums for this approach are going to be 944, so I'll put up 950 in there. All right, so 950 is in there. I'll go ahead and hit enter. It asks me to look over the approach and make sure everything's all right. Finger, Manos, Sorne, Banu, Jarrett, runway 16 is our missed approach point, and then it's got the missed approach procedure in there, so we know what's going on there. And so I will go ahead and load. Again, I don't want to activate. If I activate, that's going to take me directly to finger intersection, and that's not what I want to do. I want to continue to fly the arrival down to finger, and then I will load onto the approach. So I'll go ahead and hit load, and that will bring it into my flight plan. I can scroll with the cursor. Once I activate the field, we see it goes Monty, ropes, finger. It does have an extra intersection in here. Normally we would fly to finger and then fly that to that Mansk intersection that gives you the heading. This is just the way the GPS builds that in so that you fly that heading after you get to finger, which is what is on the arrival. Once we get a little closer and we know what we're going to do, we'll go ahead and take that out so that it won't do that. And then it's got the rest of the approach in there, so everything looks good there. You'll notice we also have Vnav points now in our flight plan too. And again, if they're white, they're not editable. I was going to show you how you could cross finger at 5,000, but it looks like we'll have to wait for SIM update 10 to come out. Once that's out, we should be able to get in there and edit our arrival Vnav points and our en route Vnav points if we want to add those. So as I approach ropes, approach contacts me and says expect the RNAV GPS to runway 16, and they tell me after finger proceed direct to Sorne. So now I can go in here and edit my flight plan. I'll go ahead and take out Mance since I'm not going to fly that portion. It says, do you want to remove that? Yes, I do. So that shows you how I can edit that. We're going now ropes direct to finger, but we do not want Manos in there either. So I will go ahead and go to Manos and clear that out as well. And that allows me to remove that point. And so now I'm going finger direct to Sorne. And if I look at my flight plan now, you can see it goes ropes to finger and then direct to Sorne. And then the rest of the approach is after that. So we can go in there and we can edit arrivals. You can also edit departures in that way if ATC were to give you a clearance, or if you want to give yourself that sort of a clearance. That's how you edit arrivals. It's just as easy to edit as it is to edit a flight plan. We'll also assume that they give us a descent clearance down to 5,000, and we'll be awaiting our approach clearance shortly. All right, so we are level at 5,000, proceeding to Sorne from finger. So we're established on that feeder route on the approach. We have not yet gotten clearance for the approach. Let's take a look at some ways that we can edit Vnav real quick and show you how those work. So let's assume that we get the following clearance. They say proceed to Sorne, cross Sorne at 3,500 feet. You're cleared for the RNAV GPS to runway 16. So they're giving us a slightly higher altitude. If we look at the chart, we can actually be at 2,100 once we get on the leg from Sorne, although we have to be at 3,000 when we're above that. So we need to go in here and change. It still gives us plenty of time. We've got a 5-mile leg from Sorne to Banu, and then a 6.8-mile leg, almost a 7-mile leg. So about 12 miles to get from 3,500 to 2,000 to be nice and stabilized for our approach at Jarrett. So it looks like we can do that. We'll go into our flight plan and we will bring up the cursor, make that active, and then we can roll over to the altitude field by Sorne. It is blue, so we can change it. And so we will roll the small cursor to get the field active. And notice where my top of descent point is right now. I'm going to use the big cursor knob to move the field and the small one to edit the field. So I'll put 3,500 in there, and there that is. And then I will hit enter. And notice how, since I need to cross that point at a higher altitude, it moves the top of descent further away. If I want to come down a little steeper, I could do that. I can go down here to the Vnav field, to the flight path angle, and if I want a steeper descent, I could put something in there like a 4 or 5, and you notice when I do that, it moves my top of descent. Again, if I make it a shallower path, it moves it closer to me. And if I make it a, let me zoom in so you can see that a little bit better. If I make it a shallower path, it moves the top of descent further away or closer to the fix, because I don't need, or excuse me, if I make a steeper path, it's going to move the approach top of descent closer to that fix and further away from me, because I don't need as much room to get down. If I make it a shallower path, it moves that top of descent towards me and away from the fix. I'll go ahead and leave it at 3 degrees, but that's another thing that you can play around with. Just be aware that, you know, if you put in a fairly steep angle, you're going to have a fairly aggressive rate of descent to maintain that angle. And it will tell you what that's going to be once you start the descent, but not before. Okay, so since I have that clearance, I'll go ahead and set up the G1000 to execute that clearance. I'll go ahead and scroll down to 3,500 feet on the altitude selector there, and I will go ahead and arm the Vnav, and the Vnav path is armed. And then once that vertical path shows up, then all I have to do is control the throttle to control the speed as I come down, and it will stay on the vertical path and at the speed that I want. So the vertical track has come alive, and as it centers up, the aircraft will start, the autopilot will start tracking that. It's now saying that that is active, and it's going to pitch down to follow that vertical path. And I guess the DA20 I just found out has a nice little auditory alarm once the vertical track comes alive, where it says vertical track. It lets you know that that is now active, or that the vertical track is there. And as far as the rest of the approach, it works just like the approach that we shot up in Bardstown with the Cessna 172. We just let it come on down to 3,500 at Sornay. Then we can descend it manually down to 2,100 until we get to Banu, and then 2,000 by the time we get to Jarrett once we cross Banu. Once we do that, we arm the approach just like we did with the other approach, and it flies exactly the same. So this is just an example of how you work the G1000, the NXI, to load approaches and departures, and how you can feed those into, or excuse me, arrivals and departures, stars and SIDS, and how you can work those in, particularly the stars into, or the approaches with the stars, how you can kind of combine those together so that it flies a nice smooth path all the way to the airport, all the way to the runway for you. So that concludes this video. Hopefully it's given you a good idea of what navigational features are available on the G1000 NXI upgrade. I think you'll agree it's a very capable piece of equipment that can greatly enhance your flight simulator flying, especially for IFR procedures. If I missed any of the key features of the unit, make sure to let me know in the comments section. As always, if you've enjoyed the content, please make sure to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.